Well, Melissa asked that I go ahead and get started. Good evening to all of you. My name is Evan Bronstein. I'm a board member of the AIA St. Louis and currently the acting treasurer. On behalf of the board, our membership, we are pleased to have the opportunity to continue our support of the SamFox public lecture series. So much so that we made it our chapter meeting tonight. So Rahul, no pressure on you, right? And also a thank you to AIA St. Louis Scholarship Trust for its stewardship of this event. This occasion and similar events like it are designed to connect and engage our collective communities. As a result, they are of extreme importance to the AIA, both locally and nationally. And hope that you'll join us after for our networking event following, where we have an opportunity to talk to some architects, as well as engage in conversation post this event. In this spirit, the American Institute of Architects represents essentially a handshake between the academic beginnings and our professional development. And in serving a broad-based constituency is a message that may require some clarity. So if you'll indulge me a moment, I'd like to share 5 key areas that the Institute seeks to serve. And it's important to note that the AIA is here to support us in various stages of our career. 5 topics are these: advocacy, education and professional development, practice support, community and networking, and public awareness and outreach. In advocacy, the AIA represents the interests of architects at the local, state, and federal levels, influencing legislation and policies that affect the built environment, sustainability, licensure, and the profession as a whole. In education and professional development, the AIA provides continuing education, conferences, certifications, and resources to help architects maintain licensure and grow professionally throughout their careers. In practice support, the AIA develops tools, best practices, contract documents, and business resources to support architects in their day-to-day practice and ensure high standards. In community and networking, the AIA, through local chapters, national events, committees, and knowledge communities, fosters connections among members and encourages collaboration, mentorship, and peer support. In public awareness and outreach, the AIA promotes the value of architecture and the role of architects to the public, clients, policymakers through campaigns, awards, publications, and public programs. And that's a perfect segue into the next components of my remarks. On the subject of awareness and outreach, this April, essentially today through the 18th, is Architecture Week. Jointly delivered by the AIA of St. Louis, their Foundation for Architecture, and our chapter membership, this evening's lecture essentially kicks off Architecture Week for all of us. And I hope that the lecture and the conversation will engage us in design and critical thinking as a way of inspiring us as we begin the week. And just to give you a sense of the balance of the engagements over the course of the week, on Tuesday, midday, we have a cohort that's going to Gateway STEM High School, and they'll be instructing students on the creative process through an interactive design challenge. And then on Wednesday morning, I and many of my colleagues will be on hand at the chapter office for what we're calling Coffee with an Architect. And this will be from 7:30 to 9 a.m. But it's really an opportunity for the public and for students that have interest to come down to our chapter offices and talk to an architect and ask questions about any number of things that are on their mind. It could be design, the built environment, community building, and so forth. And then Thursday evening marks a special event for us. It's going to be virtual. We wanted to provide a breadth or range of different offerings, but we'll provide 2 programs relative to that virtual session. The first is going to be, or one of the 2 that you can choose, is called If You Build It. It's followed by a reflection and conversation, and then the other is the reading of a children's book. And this is Designing Dreams, an official Deja the Dynamo adventure, which is written and published by architects at Canon Design, which I think would be really, really interesting. Both sessions are designed to provide a unique window into the lived experience of exploring topics in design. Some insights on the documentary. It follows an industrial designer and a builder, both trained as architects, who left corporate America to make a difference in the lives of an underserved student population in the South. The documentary chronicles their experience teaching a design-build studio, working with students, and engaging with a difficult board. How often does that happen, right? But it's an interesting documentary, and I think it's something that we'll find interesting. And both programs will offer something different to each audience. So for the reading of the children's book, naturally might skew more towards a younger audience, but there'll be opportunities for engagement in both. And lastly, we'll wrap up at our chapter offices on Friday, and this we're calling Sip and Sketch. And I think if you should stop by, you'll likely find us doing both of those things during that happy hour. And that completes the opening remarks for us as part of the AIA contribution to this lecture. So I appreciate your attention. I think I'm going to look to Eric now to give you an introduction, and I hope you enjoy the balance of the evening.
Well, thanks to AIA St. Louis and to the Washington University SamFoxschool. It's a pleasure to introduce Rahul Mehrotra. I'll keep my remarks really brief. He's the John T. Dunlop Professor in Housing and Urbanization at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He's also a Mumbai architect and the founding principal of RMA Architects there. So he spends his time between Boston and Mumbai. He's been involved in all kinds of projects there. He's designed a software campus for Hewlett-Packard in Bangalore, restored projects across India, and has also been very involved in urban activism and preserving districts of Mumbai. He's also published extensively, beginning with co-authoring Bombay, the Cities Within, and also more recently has a really interesting book on the Kumbh Mela, the annual festival. That's a kind of temporary city I think we'll be hearing more about. Also Architecture in India since 1990, and the more recent book on the kinetic city. So with that, Rahul.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you to the AIA and the SamFoxschool. Pleasure to be here. I've had a wonderful day today. My guide was Eric, and he showed me wonderful things in the city, and it really was amazing to see the diversity of possibilities. What I'm going to do today is share with you two forms of practice. One is research and one is building, and I hope I can sort of make some crossovers. And of course, I'll show some projects. I call this architecture in a time of flux because I think we are living through particularly transitional times today. And yet architecture, I believe, has not been sufficiently responsive to these processes of change. It has attempted to stall or interrupt them without translating the energies of transition into concepts and forms that are generative of livable futures. The practice of architecture has been obsessed with permanence and stability through imaging and imagining absolute solutions. To make this shift, I believe, to the transitionary thinking would mean recognizing the interconnectedness as well as the unpredictability of social, economic, political, and natural systems to address problems at all levels of the spatio-temporal. And I think we are all experiencing this as I speak. And I think architecture in a time of flux should embrace the kinetic, the temporary, and the cultures of associative values that people create spatially, as also legitimate instruments to imagine cities and the landscapes beyond. I think it's a position that regards even the act of conservation, or preservation as we call it, as a transitional means to modulate change in society, and not as an instrument necessarily only of permanence or the inevitable codification of memory forever. It could also facilitate a redemptive forgetting. Our emphasis must be, I believe, as professionals and academics, nurturing, inspiring, motivating, and mentoring future generations to calibrate and give agency to the otherwise growing schism between what I call, or their spheres of concern and their spheres of influence. And this is, it's just the spheres of concern for all of us are expanding exponentially, but our spheres of influence are diminishing. And how do we find ways through pedagogy, but also through activism and practice to calibrate these two? Otherwise, we inevitably will slip into cynicism because this will be a disjuncture. So what I'm going to sort of really show you are two forms of practice. One is research, samples of it, and the other is building. I often think about the fact that I've been educated both in India but also in the West, and what are the canons that sort of influence my thinking? Invariably, we are sort of taking theory that emerged in the industrializing West in the last century and making Asia in the same image, or Asia is making itself in the same image. And how can we find other ways of thinking about this? I mean, in that circle live 2 or 3 billion people, and how we kind of mold an imaginary of the city and architecture necessarily has to be quite different. You know, we talk about the formal city and the informal city, and these are also, I think, rubrics that are beginning to lose ground and not allowing us to act in, I think, instrumental ways. I would argue that people who live in what we think is the informal city are employed in the formal economy, and people who live in the formal cities are often employed in the informal economy. And so this doesn't even map very accurately. So aesthetics then becomes a baggage in terms of how we imagine what is formal and what is informal. I'm getting really interested in the idea of the third world, which went on to become associated with underdeveloped, poor sort of countries. But it really was a brilliant idea, which challenged Stalin's second world and fostered Dulles' first world, and offered a third option, which is what Tito, Nehru, and Nasser said. And so, I mean, for me, that's an inspirational idea to find how, I mean, not only for all of us as citizens to think about how we imagine politics differently and ideology differently, but also what does that mean in terms of the form of the city, in terms of participatory planning, in terms of architecture. And so these have been, I think nature is the new sacred. And I think we are all struggling to be nourished and motivated by how we can create our relationships with nature. So for me, looking at the tropics as a zone, for me, theory must emanate from that kind of imaginary, not otherwise. And this is a wonderful image of the monsoon clouds approaching Mumbai, and they bring with them great hope, but they also bring destruction and displacement. And I mean, whether it's the rubric of climate change, which I believe has become so large that all we are doing is describing and redescribing the problem and not finding, as architects, ways we can actually act within that rubric. But I think these become categories we have to take much more seriously. Religion comes out of geographies and particularities, right? And so Judaism, Islam, Christianity came out of places where the resources were minimal till they discovered oil. And so you had to love your neighbor to survive. In the tropics, Hinduism perpetuated individualism. Yoga was about the individual, or meditation was about the individual reconciling themselves with themselves. And so religions always came out and responded to very particular geographic and climatic sort of zones. Aesthetics came out of that, right? I mean, the minimalism that we sort of see in the West comes out of, I mean, Bergman's films of those brooding clouds on these flat landscapes give you minimalism, which we now try to apply in Asia, where we have traditionally always mimicked nature, which provide a surfeit, right? And nature became part of our ornament. But we resist that, and we flatten images across the globe, because in that image making also lies hope in terms of finding what the problems and the issues are. I mean, a Mughal painting, look at the density of layers there. It really captures living in a particular environment, which we don't even use for inspiration. For me, this is a wonderful painting by an artist called Mani Soni, who was, it was in an exhibition titled The Sacred Everyday, Embracing the Risk of Difference. And this was an exhibition where he'd been commissioned to create a 24-panel series on the episodes from the New Testament by Paul Abraham. And this was the painting he did of the Last Supper, which is how it must have actually happened, in a courtyard sitting around on the floor in the Middle East somewhere, correct? The Renaissance, of course, completely transformed that image, and that is what we consumed. And so therefore, I think the images that we are excited about, we embrace, that we learn through, are located very specifically in geographies and climates which we've forgotten. And this flattening and all the despair we have about globalization and the tyranny of images that it has perpetuated across the globe, I think really needs to be interrogated. And we're at a moment where if we are if we are embracing nature as the new sacred, I think we've got to go into these sorts of depths. This is a sketch that is, for me, very inspirational by Charles Correa, the Indian architect, where he talked about these two streams. That's the Acropolis, the Western canon, the architectural object as an autonomous, symmetrical object that sits on the hill, which led then to, well, Palladio, and then from that to Corb. This is a sketch he made. But on the other hand, the caves of Ajanta and in Aurangabad, the caves, which are about detracting, taking away, they set up a completely different relationship with nature, where their anxiety is not about the symmetry, about the facade, but about the experience and the adaptability, in a way, with nature. And so from that, you get these two paradigms, the symmetry of Palladio, where the symmetry is externalized, right? And whereas the Asian courtyard house, where the symmetry is internalized. So you see urban fabrics, which are very organic, but every courtyard there is a square because it resides in the symmetry internally. And as an extension of that, ostentation is also internalized. It's not externalized. They're two completely different paradigms worth paying attention to. Or I look at Gandhi's house. This is Gandhi's house in the Gandhi ashram in Ahmedabad. And if you look at it, it's a courtyard. Sorry, I don't have a laser pointer here, so I'm not sure. Oh, yeah, well, I can try to do that. So this is the entrance veranda, which you see in this image. And through that wall, you go to another veranda around which are rooms. So the ambiguity there in terms of what is the public, what is the private, what is used for what, is just tremendously beautiful in a kind of completely minimal way. In addition to that, the southern tropes, and this is, Pedro Levi-Bismarck, and we often look at the South then as architects who can fetishize material and craft and handmake things. It's sort of associated with poverty and all of that. But I think Pedro Levi-Bismarck challenged that, and he said it's sitting in their own artificial paradises within their own biospheric universe. What he means that it has been placed, that architecture we see and we celebrate coming out of the South is placed over the layers of underdevelopment, poverty, but often the clients are not poor. And so again, it's an aesthetic baggage that we've come to even create our forms of recognition, awarding, etc. So for me, these are issues that have been central in trying to challenge how one might actually operate in that context. Another inspirational figure is this golden prop of the Jaina Siddha. Jainism, like Buddhism, were two reform movements to the extremism of Hinduism at some point. It's the enlightened quester, standing in a posture where he has left the body as well as the world of images behind, yet constitutes a compelling anti-image. This archetypical, even cosmic figure stands for the profound interconnectedness among three domains: Manushya, which is humankind, the mandala, the cosmos, and manthan, or the transformative process of churning generated by the coming together of seemingly contradictory or even conflicting systems of thought. This reconciliation, which is really what design is. Design is the synthesis of contesting demands. I think is a principle that would give us, if we took seriously, it would, and even at the level of the city, I think urban design's challenge in the future is going to be how one makes very disparate parts of the city work in adjacency to each other. How do you make two seemingly contradictory things sit together and create a condition which sort of propels us into something else? And from that, I think I would challenge our understanding of the context. We've become very limited in the way we define the context, which is usually in architecture schools, we look at climate, we look at, material, we look at things that are tangible. Some of us are more ambitious and we excavate the terrain, look at embedded histories, begin to respond to some of that. But I think the more exciting challenge is to place the context in its context. That is, you nestle this context in the super context that we are all experiencing very brutally these days, whether it's climate change, political conditions, etc. Because I think then we can potentially create a more nuanced and productive reading of the site of our interventions. And so these are how do you construct such meta-narratives. And I think one family of meta-narratives that fundamentally challenge our forms of engagement as designers is that of the contemporary rapid geo-economic integration and now reaction to it and the uneven spatial development that emerges from that. I think inequity will be the biggest issue for the next generation for the next few decades for sure. And the evidence of this, one doesn't look further than all the shifting demographics that are occurring, whether it's the refugees, whether it's migrants, all of that. Because I think when we begin to nestle the context of our work in that understanding of that broader context, you begin to, I think, be nourished by, you see intersections where you can intervene. And my colleague Yves Blau said in the context of East Europe that these transitions aren't clear. It's not a matter of transitioning from one condition or even ideological form to the other politically. It is about simultaneous transitions because, like, for example, East Europe or India, we have been transitioning out of socialism into capitalism for 2 decades now. It's not a clear transition. So the muddle you see in the environment, in the built environment, is because there are different ideologies at play simultaneously, and these transitions then result in a third condition which might be different. So again, recognizing this as architects, I think we begin to, I think this is related to the notion of the sphere of concern and the sphere of influence. And so this rubric of think globally and act locally, for me, it resonates even more than ever. We've been acting globally and thinking globally, unfortunately. And so for me, and I come to now the practices, we have really questioned our modes of engagement. And I believe, we've worked through these sort of categories in reflection, one which has to do with research theory and pedagogy. The other is how do you translate that into advocacy? That's a very important bridge. And then practice. Otherwise, these can also be differentiated. And for me, research often, one has attempted to translate research into instruments of advocacy, because otherwise we say we are constructing instruments of advocacy, or we try to construct the instruments of advocacy and engage with advocacy simultaneously. Often, I think our role as creators and imaginers of the instruments of advocacy can be even more powerful. And so with that, I'll share with you some of our research thinking. A lot of it is what I call propositional research, which is where the primary focus is really on formulating and exploring propositions, which are statements that suggest potential relationships between concepts, often used in fields where direct empirical testing in many of our fields might be difficult. And this serves as a starting point, and a lot of what I'm going to show you is in that spirit, for further investigation and theory development. Essentially, it involves exploring theoretical connections between ideas rather than immediately testing specific hypotheses with concrete data. And so this is the spirit in which some of this sort of work has been done. This is the writing on the kinetic city. And for me, the framing of the phenomena of urbanism, as I see it, at least in India and many parts of Asia, under the rubric of temporal landscapes or ephemeral urbanism, as I'm going to show you, or the kinetic city, is more inspirational as a category than the informal city. The informal city is, again, one of those rubrics that is universalizing the problem in a non-productive way. The slums in Mumbai are completely different from the favelas in Rio de Janeiro, and we construct theory which universalizes how we act in them, and that's why we make no headway. The politics, the locality, in Mumbai, Dharavi is a center of economic growth. The favelas are where you have lumpen youth and contestations. Geographically, they're located differently. And so for me, the idea of the temporal, the kinetic, is much more inspirational. And this is an urbanism that is created by those outside the elite domains of the formal modernity of the state. And it's the idea that the Indian scholar Ravi Sundaram refers to as a pirate modernity that slips under the laws of the city to simply survive without any conscious attempt at constructing a counterculture. Here, architecture is not even the single spectacle of the city, and instead festivals and other forms of celebration complement the architecture as the spectacle. In fact, festivals allow the subaltern to create a forum of self-expression, both cultural and political. So this is an image, I call this the landscape of impatient capital. Architecture is intrinsically impatient, or capital, sorry, is intrinsically impatient, and terrains like Dubai, Singapore, Shanghai, that make the landing of capital frictionless, as have downtowns done in many parts of America, where capital can realize its value, creates brittle form like this, right? And I mean, of course, capital gets very patient when it resides in foundations and universities, and that's why their role is to sustain humankind in a longer kind of durée. And the other image that you see there is the example of the Ganesh festival, where the spectacle of the city is co-joined with the architecture, albeit on a temporal scale. And here, the Ganesh festival is one example where immersion here becomes a metaphor for the spectacle of the city, because as that clay idol dissolves, they have 300 clay idols that are immersed after 10 days of celebration in the water of the bay. The spectacle comes to a close. There are no static or permanent mechanisms to encode the spectacle. Here, the memory of the city is an enacted process, a temporal moment, as opposed to buildings that contain the public memory as static or permanent entities. The kinetic city obviously cannot be seen as a design tool. Rather, it's a demand that conceptions of urbanism create and facilitate environments that are versatile, flexible, robust, and ambiguous enough to allow the kinetic quality of the city to flourish. And it was based on this that we were asking or challenging the idea of the city as a stable entity. And that led us to this wonderful project, which was the Kumbh Mela. This is a Hindu festival that occurs every 12 years. Smaller forms occur every 4 years. It's on the confluence of the Ganges and the Yamuna. And about 7 million people live here for 55 days, and they make a whole city to house them. And about 120 million people visit on 5 auspicious days. And it's a tented city, but an incredible organization. To make a city that is 7 million people for 55 days is no easy task. Just to give you some images of what it sort of feels like, this was a project we did at Harvard University, and this is just a segment I'm going to show you from an installation we had done, but it'll just put some images to the place. I mean, this is a lecture in itself, and I can't go into the details. But the belief is that if you bathed at the confluence of these sacred rivers on these 5 sacred days, you're freed from rebirth. It's a compelling idea which attracts people over and over again. So. Yeah, these are bridges they put across. They're pontoon bridges. Every street goes across in the form of a bridge. It's impeccably kept. It was the cleanest Indian city I've ever lived in. It has all the attributes of a city: electricity, water supply, sewage, the police, the fire brigade, hospitals, clinics. It sort of simulates a city in all its domains, so to speak. And then, of course, it is a religious occurrence, and so there are lots of rituals, gatherings that are related, to that aspect. And, it's a coming together of the state and private enterprise, in this case, religious groups, etc. In any case, it was a project that went across many schools within Harvard University. So it was truly an interdisciplinary project. And what I learned from it is that to do an interdisciplinary project, it has to be an out-of-the-box idea, where no one discipline actually owns the domain. Otherwise, you enter the problem or understanding it with biases. And this was a case where no one could figure out what they were going to expect and how they would map this, an ephemeral megacity. And it sits at the confluence of these 2 rivers. That's an image, satellite image during the monsoon, where it's flooded. When the waters recede, on the sandbanks, this city is built. No foundations. It's the lightest mega city that sort of exists, albeit temporarily. That's an image we took in October where it was yet flooded. When we went back on the 14th of January, that's the same tree from the same spot, a whole city had emerged. People call it a pop-up city. It's not. It's a deliberate state enterprise. And it's really planned over the year. And like I said, it has all the domains that a regular city would have. It's on a grid. The grid allows it to be robust, that if the river moves, the city is yet quite stable. They leave a buffer. And every street goes out across the river as a pontoon bridge. So it's incredibly stable in that sense. If there's an unseasonal flooding, for example, it's very, very stable in terms of circulation. The whole city is made out of these 5 materials. It's a kit of parts. That's why anything above the ground is these 5 materials. It can be assembled and disassembled very easily. That 8-foot bamboo in red is what aggregates to create superstructures that house 1,000 people sometimes, down to a single family tent which someone might stay in for 55 days. And these transform with the textile and other things. But it's a kit of parts, so it can be dismantled very easily, which is what happens at the end of 55 days. It's dismantled, the monsoon arrives, and it leaves no trace. So we basically were very inspired by this, and so we extended it into this research called ephemeral urbanism. Learning from what I just was critical about in terms of informality, we again thought the ephemeral needs to be constructed to understand it in a taxonomy where there are different occurrences. Because even, all the way from markets to refugee camps, they're completely different. You can't be putting them in the same sort of box. And we called it, cities in a constant state of flux. Again, this is just to give you some glimpses of the kind of research. But again, it looked at many such occurrences around the world with the idea that we would construct a taxonomy to be able to understand these better. So, these are occurrences that happen for trade. They happen for the snowbirds who escape. This is, of course, the Kumbh Mela itself, which I'll just forward a little bit. It's sort of, and so these are the sorts of cases. We were stunned at how many cases of this form of ephemeral occurrences within the rubric of ephemeral urbanism that occurred around the globe, which is what the book then finally captured. And this is the taxonomy we constructed, that there were the landscapes of religion, they were extensive. And so what we did then was created the taxonomy, which is religion, celebration, transaction, extraction, disaster, military, and refuge. And these are completely different in terms of their time, their rhythms, their dates of expiration. And it allows you to then begin to take each of these categories and imagine what you could learn from it, but also how interventions could be made through design. And we tried to position this in the language of urban planning and design in terms of the metrics, the drawings, so that we could carry it into our discussions, basically infect the discussion on urban design and urban planning with the ephemeral as a real force. And this was the book that came out of it. So learning from that is the question of the provocation. Are we making permanent solutions sometimes for temporary problems, right? The 2,000 abandoned shopping malls in America are an example of that, with a massive amount of tarmac that surrounds them. And we often design absolute solutions. So when we even look at cities that we want to rebuild, we look at it through the lens of architecture, often in urban design, as a way of being able to fix them and invest and build and infills. But we could also look at it through a kind of temporal lens of the ephemeral. I mean, I was struck today driving around that there was a circus camped in town, and the circus did that historically. I mean, if you had 20 pneumatic structures that did the infills where temporary occurrences of activity happen, you begin to, on that temporal rhythm, be activating the city. So you don't always, and you can test it. The Mughals did it when they built their cities. They actually had a tented city till it worked, and then they built an actual city, including Fatehpur Sikri, for example. So this then led me to looking at tents, because I said, how within the ephemeral, what is a form of architecture? And this is a special issue of Marg magazine, which is an art magazine we just recently did, which just looks at tents, because they're light, they're agile, they're adaptable, they're ephemeral. And it's an issue that, it's got scholars that talk about textiles, Mughal textiles, what went into making tents. But we also talk about contemporary tents. And for me, it was an emblem of it is the most enduring emblem of human settlements. tents, in a sense. And so how could one look at it innovatively? And of course, they're Mughal tents. Tents have been attachments to buildings because they extend the use of the building. I mean, in the sense like the Olympics in London, Zaha Hadid's stadium for swimming could have, it could be reduced after the pneumatic structures that were used. We looked at the Bedouin tents, incredible logic in the way they camped and they set them up, but also the SOM, the Hajj terminal, Fry Autos, beautiful tents in Munich, albeit the fact is they're not temporary in that sense. They've now been there for 30 years, but in a long durée, they are temporary, and they could technically be dismantled much more easily. And then ordinary tents, these are beautiful markets in Bangladesh. Just look at that pattern, a perfect grid, and they're massive, massive markets that get constructed at times of festivals and otherwise. Or this wonderful wedding tent in Dubai, where, the architecture of impatient capital, or the impatience of capital, is challenged by this ephemeral category. And I think the research questions were this notion of uncertainty, and how do we nuance uncertainty on a temporal scale, the life cycle of materials, how do we look at life cycles, embedding temporality in our disciplinary thinking, and theorizing permanency and temporality for the house. The house is where it breaks down in a way, because that's where we want the most stability, right? And so how does one actually theorize around that? And the idea of the permanent temporariness. And so I think with that, I go into advocacy and how some of this we moved into advocacy. These are my books on Mumbai, which were really instruments of advocacy, because with that we created a voice, and we managed to get the first legislation for urban conservation in India in Mumbai in 1995. But that wasn't stopping it, because the legislation is only the first step. And then we began to take that historic district, but begin to create associations, register them, begin to give new character, to ask the question, what might be the contemporary engine that drives the process of transformation? And so we found 34 banks where you see it's yellow. We called it a banking district. We made an association. We saw art accumulated where the purple is, and we created an art district. And we began to then use those communities to propel change as well as conserve these buildings. So it meant, of course, instituting a festival to raise money, signage, street furniture, things that don't happen in India otherwise, just whitewashing buildings that were under rent control that no one was maintaining, that brought life to the area. Very inexpensive to do, but it transformed the area. Taking the parking lot and getting a sponsor to pave it so that it could be used for discussions. That's a painting by Hussain, who's a very famous Indian architect, which was auctioned to raise money for the association. And then look at gallery space on the streets, but really animate it through defining a contemporary engine and a purpose which could transform the area. And that money also led us to actually restore historic buildings. These are beautiful Gothic buildings, grade 1 buildings, which were restored by a young architect. I was acting as the client because I was part of the association. But also contemporary interventions. This is a visitor center for the Prince of Wales Museum, which is an Indo-Saracenic building, becomes a gateway to the museum, but it's reversible. You can disassemble this in 48 hours so that another generation might have another way to deal with it. And then taking a whole lot of post-industrial spaces, this is a printing press, and converting them into spaces for art. Very simple, ordinary spaces, but they created a massive network of art spaces in a way to revive the district. I mean, this was an ordinary a car garage for repairing cars, which became a beautiful space for installation art, for example. But that led us to doing conservation at another scale. This is the Chaumala Palace in Hyderabad, which we conserved and converted into a museum for the Nizam's legacy. And the Taj Mahal, where we worked with the government for 10 years to create a site management plan, and a book which captures a lot of that work. Again, these are entire lectures in themselves, but also extending that into pedagogy. So these are studios, and I ran a studio where we didn't look at the Taj, but we looked at Agra and how the city of Agra and the poverty in Agra would finally kill the Taj. And unless you fixed Agra, you couldn't fix the Taj. And so it expanded the discussion. So really what I learned from much of this advocacy was that conservation is an instrument of planning that helps society modulate the rate of change. If we make it a separate silo and we develop the narratives of nostalgia, we can't often get very far. But conservation historic preservation has to desperately be re-embedded in the planning discourse, because it finally, China under Mao could take change. There was a cultural revolution, right? The British haven't gotten over the fact that the sun is set on their empire, so they're incredibly nostalgic. So every society can deal with change in different ways. And I think for us as designers, understanding that, I think, nuances the way we can intervene. But then there are extreme problems like sanitation, and how does one intervene there? And so this is where, in the advocacy work, we've taken research and coupled it with pedagogy, but also advocacy. And this is what you have for toilets in the slums of Mumbai. In Mumbai, it's one toilet for about 800 people. It's just madness. And so we've developed prototypes to see how they can become hubs for sanitation. We've entered competitions. We've been successful, unsuccessful most often. We've developed manuals, which we have raised money for and then given out to NGOs to build these hubs for sanitation during the pandemic. For example, developed design prototypes, again, could be reversible. So it's an act of optimism where you don't don't make the public toilet a monument, so to speak. And then extending that into studios where through pedagogy one can be more expansive. And now I've started mapping this to understand where those intersections, these are all the catalogs and the books that I've worked on, and how they sit in these sort of categories of advocacy, where they overlap. And we've begun to now map what are the themes that one can extract from them in the way I've just been summarizing how I understand conservation or what I mean by the kinetic. But these themes then become, again, instruments by which one can also propel the way one designs. It becomes a set of values, because theory is finally about reflecting on what you see on the ground, but also to give you a moral compass, so to speak. And so for me, the research, and this is the first part of the practice, I'm going to go into projects now. The first part of the practice is really about creating that moral compass and really discerning the patterns and understanding the context of the context. So therefore, one can bring what I would think are more relevant values and appropriate values to the design project itself. And so that becomes one part of the project. And so here I'm going to run you through a few homes, workspaces, a couple of institutions, and some dwelling or a little housing project. And I'll go through this fast. This is all fun design stuff, so it won't be as heavy as the first part. And so context matters. This is Mumbai. We all started our practices by building in the hinterland, weekend homes for people. I once met a contractor on a boat going across to my site, and I asked him, he said he was designing the house for a really famous pop star. So I said, wow, who's the architect who got to do her project? And he said, no, I'm doing it, I'm designing it. I said, what do you mean you're designing it? He said, she just gave me a photograph of the White House and asked me to copy it. So he constructed this thing that looked like the White House for her weekend home. And that is highly problematic, because that sets up a polarization between very urban people, often affluent, and who go to the countryside, which is normal, and the rural areas often poor. There are people who work as staff or clean their homes, or all of that. And so architecture can play a kind of mediating role, and that, I think, it was my first project, and when he told me this and I saw the project, I realized that wasn't the way to go. And, going back to the courtyard house and the villa, which I've already talked about, one began to do a series of homes there. And this is an early one we did in 2000, where it was for a young filmmaker and his family. And that is the living room, the porch. The American installation at the Venice Biennale is the porch. And in fact, they saw this project and called me, and I spoke to Susan about the project. But the living room is the porch. And it has a water tap, which means villagers can come and help themselves to the water. They move the furniture in when they're not there. They're hardly there 7 times in a year. And the caretaker of the house actually uses the porch as his living room with his family when the people who own the house are not there. So this is kind of a dual coding to the project by making this a generous offering, so to speak, to the village. And the plan has been articulated carefully. You see the tap there, which is accessible to anyone. The water is collected. The roofs are sloped in to collect the water. The slab over the circulation area is a large gutter that propels the water into a well, so they always have fresh water. So it becomes an offering to the village, but yet for the owners, it's a wonderful place to be in. On a weekend, it's good weather. It's a teak forest in a sense, so they have great views, or had. Now, of course, there's a lot of building. The second house was for a very well-known doctor who is the one who actually discovered drug-resistant tuberculosis. And he wanted a house in the village. He wanted a villa, almost like the White House. Somehow that idea of the villa is seductive. But I saw there was a village that was encroaching on his property, and soon that property was going to be encompassed completely by the village. And so then, of course, the challenge became, how do you embed a house? And for me, it also became a research project of sorts. And I asked the question that how, if for a rich person we were building a weekend home, how would we do it for a middle-class family? And we basically broke the house into components, a living and a dining room on the top, the bedrooms at the bottom, a lap pool with a study for the doctor and a guest room as a bar. So someone could also build this incrementally in stages without ruining the integrity, the architectural integrity of the project. And that's how it sort of sits in the landscape. It's a base of the local stone with these plastered light walls with the roofs. And the inside is just cement floors. It's a layer of courtyard, so it's very much, again, the image from the interior. The lap pool is treated in a more introverted way, because I feel that's also problematic. When you have a swimming pool in the garden, you have gardeners toiling there, and otherwise everyone else sort of engaged in hedonistic kind of activities. So how this can be discreet, but also used in a hot climate, it actually cools the house, becomes a courtyard. So you kind of reinterpret that. And again, this sort of connection with nature, but more sort of subtly. And then, for the people who are farming in the villages, it sits in terms of its scale, I believe, much more comfortably. The insides are very ambiguous. Sliding doors that can be adjusted if the larger family is there. If they have guests, it's used differently. And we've done a series of houses, I'll just run through them, where we've really attempted to create this form of discretion, but also this commingling with nature, in a sense, with open-to-sky spaces that can really be used much more easily. And in this case, there's sliding doors there that can close the pool off, which is partly inside and partly outside. This was a case where it's a house for 3 families and a workspace, so it was very large. And what we essentially did was wrap the house around the existing trees. So the house really embraces nature that was already there. And again, it's a loose set of spaces. To go to a larger scale, this is in Hyderabad. It's Cyberabad, which is the IT center in Hyderabad. And when I went to see the site, it was for an infrastructure company. I saw every building in Hyderabad had fishing nets wrapped around it, because the state was going through a kind of political conflict where they wanted to divide the state into 2, into Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. And so these glass buildings, this is the Mercedes-Benz showroom, these glass buildings built in these sort of global images, or images of globalization, so to speak, were perfect for rioters to stone. So when they sold you the curtain glazing, they actually gave you an option of details as well as colors for fishing nets. So it became kind of part of the product that was being sold. And it really made me think that if these images that get propelled, this tyranny of images that circulate in the on the globe are so powerful that it makes no sense given the political climate and understanding those dynamics. So we were instead inspired by this little hut in Jaipur, which is, they put up 200 of these. It's a water cooler. That guy mans it. It's sponsored by a business association. He puts his kettle out, and he's ready for business. Anyone can go to him. They just cup their hand and they drink clean, safe, cool water. There are no plastic cups involved. It's very beautiful, very humane. Every once in a while, he takes a break and he comes out and he humidifies the hut. So through evaporative cooling, the hut stays cool. And the water inside is in large clay jars, so that stays cool. It's as simple as you can get. Talk about sustainability and all of that. And through evaporative cooling, all of this stays cool because this is not fired and glazed. And then that beautiful kettle is the only thing he brings. And it's a very humane sort of experience. And so this is what sort of inspired us. And we said we were doing a project in Jaipur, which I'll show you. And we thought Hyderabad has a similar kind of climate. It's in the center of the country. We came up with a building for this corporate office of infrastructure, which is it's a 5-floor high garden on all sides. And it has different species. We grew them in the nursery. We decided to, so, instead of making patterns in Alacobond and all sorts of other material, we said, let's make a skin. But it's a performative skin, which is, it's not a green wall where you have those spots and you make a beautiful art piece out of it. But this is performative in the way it works as a screen. There's a spraying system within the facade which keeps the plants moist. The plants grow in hydroponic trays, so it's very efficient. This is a range of species based on which side, north, south, east, west, how much sun they can take. It is a trellis that we fabricated in this little factory, which is all hand cast from recycled aluminium and handmade. And the clients were in a hurry, the impatience of capital. So we finished the buildings for them. They got the cows. They did all the prayers. They occupied the building. But we asked them for 2 more years to grow the facade. And the facade took 2 more years. And on that trellis, finally, the facade grew. And it's become a wonderful space. Each facade is completely different. It attracts butterflies. These are young people who work in the firm who go to watch birds. There's a podium, which again is a great place for socializing. It has atriums. It ventilates, gets the hot air out. It has skylights which take the light out. The interconnections between the sandwich in the middle is the tendering department that needed privacy. And, we did this rather intuitively, and we are trying to map it now to see how we can actually understand how it's performing. And, we couldn't get a LEED certificate. But that building, which is across the street from us, got a LEED certificate. Because, as I was talking earlier to Eric and others, the LEEDs it's become a chemical or mechanical fix to a problem. Now we have Griha in India, which looks at also passive cooling and gives you points for that. But otherwise, LEEDs and many other, it's the hegemony of the green industry in a sense, and it's perpetuated. And that building got a LEED, like the walkie-talkie building in London, for example, that we all sort of know about. Yeah, but that's what the inside feels like. The plant's ornament. This isn't a stage image, as you can see. It's messy. We just went in. I saw this. The gardeners work there. The gardeners are the real heroes of the building. They are the lowest paid employees in the corporation, but the facade and the image of the building is dependent on them. So there's a lot of empathy, respect, and dignity that they feel in the building. And as a result, when you talk to people in the building, they're friends. They reach out to them to get a bouquet of flowers to take home, or, they have a great sort of synergy. And like I said, the image of the building, a friend of mine said, you've really created green jobs because the image of the building is dependent on the lowest paid in the corporation. And they make eye contact with their bosses. They're blinds we have, but no one puts them down. Sometimes they do if they want the privacy, but usually they don't. And this, woman wouldn't have been dressed in a sari if she was just working in the garden that was outside the building. But within the building now, they are much more present, and the conference room there, as you can see, is open. The blinds are not put down. The privacy sort of goes. I'm just going to read a quote from a friend, Marty Chen. Marty Chen is at the Kennedy School of Government, and she's really the world's authority on the informal economy. She talks about the informal economy, and I read this, and it made me think, because what she said, and I quote her, is she said, what is needed most fundamentally is a new economic paradigm, a model of a hybrid economy that embraces the traditional and the modern, the small scale and the big scale, the informal and the formal. What is needed is an economic model that allows the smallest units and the least powerful workers to operate alongside the largest units and the most powerful economic players. And by default, in a sense, this building did that. We didn't design this with this social agenda. We designed it more as a performative facade. But in learning about it, I realized this was something that one should extract as a lesson and has helped us inform other projects. So just a very quick clip to give you a sense. And this building is old now. It's about 20 years old. And this was some of the imagery from earlier. This is the misting that keeps it. It's more atmospheric, but it keeps the plants moist. people come from the city to see. It becomes a cloud often, so it's become a bit of a spectacle. But it's really hydroponic trays that do the work of really irrigating the plants. And I'll just sort of go forward, yeah. And then that's sort of what it feels like. It's a solar roof, and this is when it had become a woolly monster. That happens every few years, and then they have to give it a haircut. So I shot this when it was at its worst, in a sense. In the summer, they keep it like this because it's very cool, but otherwise in the winter, they trim the plants and they manicure it a little more. And you see what the landscape around it is, and it sort of, it sits in this garden, which is a municipal garden, which the clients adopted, and now it feels like it's emerging, so to speak, out of the garden. But you see the kind of business as usual architecture around it, which is really not. They were going to build a second block, which I think the economy collapsed at that point, and they didn't complete it, otherwise there would have been 2 buildings. I come to this next project. I'm going to show you 2 or 3 institutions really quickly. This is CEPT in Ahmedabad. That's the building designed by Doshi. I studied there, and I was asked to design a library, and I was given a site. Christopher Benninger, American architect who also taught there, did the master plan, and they asked us to do this building. And it was a really consultative process because architecture school, I had to present. It was the first building which was a non-Doshi building on the campus, so there was a lot of pressure, and one had to present to students, faculty, and I studied there, so one was very respectful. And the program they gave me meant a 6-story building, which was going to be sacrilege on a site like that. So instead what we did was we treated it as a conservation project where we stayed with every datum line that Doshi had established and did a building that went 3 floors under the ground. And that way we could keep the scale of the campus, but also add something new which propels conversations, but also propels it stabilizes in a way the incremental growth of the campus. And so the building was a complicated section because it went 3 floors into the ground, but we insisted on taking light all the way down so that you had natural light. And it really was a series of buildings within a building. So we created a large canopy which protected it for climate. It has a louver system which is operatable. You have a box in there, which is the reading rooms and the ancillary facilities, and then you have the book stacks, which is a 3rd building that is within it. And each building has its own sectional logic. The outer shell is 3.5 meters, the inner one is 3 meters, and the building with the book, the carrels, is 2.4 meters or 8 feet because you can reach out to a book very easily. So it's 3 buildings that are sort of nestled into each other, but what emerges above the ground is something that's in scale with everything else. And the louvers, as you can see here, can be manipulated based on the time of the day, the season, and how much light is really needed. And that's how it sits on the campus. It picks up on those datums. You have a courtyard that brings light and takes light all the way down to the basement. This is just gypsum board. It could be very inexpensive because it's protected by the outer shell. And the big challenge was to break away from the exposed brick concrete, which was the vocabulary of the campus, which is actually not even possible to do today in terms of costs and other parameters that we had to. And the ground floor is an open, ambiguous space for reviews, for students to use. And then as you go down, you see the other building, which is the book stacks, and the carrels that are within that, and the courtyards that take light all the way down to the lowest level. And what we really did was we're conscious about the fact that if your view corridor was more diagonal, you would never feel like you were in basements. And so therefore, from any level, you can at least see very clearly 2 or 3 levels, and you always register a space where there is natural light. So that claustrophobia you would otherwise feel if you were in a basement and a 3rd basement, you don't feel. So it's very expansive in the way those view corridors go. And this is what the facade looks like. There's a catwalk there with a channel to strap a harness if you want to go to operate the louvers. And that space, so it's the 2 facades, and then it goes down to the basement taking light. There are these bridges that connect the building in the 4 directions. So it really sits on the campus in an interesting way, and then through that shaft, you have light that goes down even to the lowest basement, where along this sort of exposed concrete wall, the outer shell is all exposed concrete, and as it from the ground level is a datum, everything else is much lighter concrete, and what's above is much darker gray concrete, again, to calibrate the light. And these are the carrels that sort of sit in that courtyard. And there are no columns, there are just these portals in concrete, exposed concrete, that hold the building up along the four edges. So the inside is very free, and that's how that building stack could occur. And the louvers can be manipulated and adjusted. We created a manual in 2 languages for students to operate it. We tried to make it part of the pedagogy, so a course could actually use it to measure the climate, etc. At night, it takes on a completely different feel. And talking about attachments, they needed a space for convocations, so we finally did the plaza, and we created this attachment to the building, which gets removed when they don't need it, but now this becomes a space for convocation instead of building another big hall or auditorium. And so this becomes a kind of tent that extends above it around the whole plaza to accommodate the convocation. The base is designed to create these places for students to sit and be occupied. It's very popular for meals, for people to work. And then from that, I go to a building that it's the School of Arts and Sciences in Ahmedabad. And here it was on Ahmedabad University, but they were not clear what the composition of programs would be. So we designed this building as an armature. So what you see as the gray surfaces is where the services are, the ducts, the staircases, the elevators. Everything in between them can be manipulated and moved back and forth depending on the requirement of space. So really, it does work as an armature, which you can see in this diagram. And the 2 ends, which are the east and west, we've used the same louvering system. So within each of those frames, you either have open space, you can have glass, you can have louvers, you can have green. So where they didn't need the space right now, we created a terrace garden. And this would change over time. So within that armature, it creates a sense of flexibility. And in the process, at every point you cut the section of the building, it's very, very different in terms of its spatial makeup and its sectional quality. And we developed a kit of parts like this where we said, how do you create within a big armature like this, an institution, a sense of intimacy? And so these are components that create a sense of buildings within the building, and they're identified in different materials and colors. So they create interest within that armature as you go through the building. This is a library which works at a completely different sectional logic, so therefore it feels like a building within that armature, and it's identified separately through the color, a series of these little places to sit and work and platforms, which create that sense of intimacy I was talking about and allow sociability, spaces for sociability. And then a School of Public Policy, which we did on the IIM campus. So Louis Kahn designed the old IIM campus. This is an annex that a local architect has designed, and we got to do the School of Public Policy there, which is a building which, again, plays with this notion of ambiguous space. It's a portal, and within the portal, you have different sectional logics where the classrooms are, where the faculty is situated, and then you have a ramp which you can see in silhouette in the night shot that connects it all. And so therefore, it's very ambiguous. Amphitheaters become staircases to the library. The circulation spaces are very generous for outdoor gathering. That was part of the brief. And at every level, there are pockets you can sit at and overlook. So the classrooms are little boxes that are set within the portal. And it's a little city within that large frame. And the promenade of the landscape, of course, seeing the mill owners and seeing all the buildings Cobb did in Ahmedabad, one was necessarily inspired, but of course done quite differently, and you can operate the louvers again to create different light qualities. And this was just a mapping we did of the ambiguous spaces on every level. And you see the density of what are ambiguous spaces is huge, but that actually contributes to the success of the building. It allows faculty to program space depending on their needs. And it's for older students because it's a School of Public Policy, so people from the government. And the idea was to create a sense of informality. I will just have 2 last projects. This is a very recent project, which is it's a museum in a village outside Mumbai because land was cheaper there, where a couple had been collecting stuff for 30 years. They have 500 antiquities, really going back to Mohenjo-daro. And I mean, these are really very rare pieces. And they wanted to create a gift for the city, but they had to build it outside. So we were again confronted with this idea, how do you embed this in an existing village, a rural landscape? And of course, scale was important. But here, also what I showed you in that diagram of Palladio versus the caves, we tried to create a building that would respond differently to different aspects of its site in terms of scale, but in terms of visibility, etc. So it's a building with many, many facades, so to speak. And that's what the plan looks like. It's a very kind of subtle entrance here. It's very cave-like. And what you see here are the variations in light. It was all about modulating light. Those are the galleries. And where you see light more prominent, that is the L here, the offices, the conservation lab, the staff quarters, the storage, the public toilets, and that's the gallery space. And so it has, and the requirement was also to have a house on top of the building. So when you enter, again, it's enigmatic in that it doesn't tell you what you're going to see. There are no openings on the facade. The light is always indirect through a series of skylights. A little granite slab marks the threshold from where you begin to feel you're going to enter something. And you enter through that crack, literally. That door swings open. It's a very large door. And then it's just spaces that have courtyards. This is just the common spaces outside which begin to introduce the museum. But the inside is all about modulating light for these antiques and of course localized lighting, but also sometimes sky lighting to complement it. It's very cave-like in the way you traverse the spaces and the scale of the objects then determine how that lighting is done or what's dark and what is light. There are rooms, episodically, there are rooms which are like shrine rooms where the original objects are in spaces that would have been the scale of the original temples or sacred spaces they might have been in. So therefore, there's also an attempt to spatially punctuate. So it's not a big white box, but it punctuates the spaces based on the need of those particular objects. And again, there are different sorts of skylights and colors which are symbolic of, Vishnu or Shiva or whoever the god would be. And the staircases that take you up, again, pick up on those sorts of forms and experiential qualities of light being sort of modulated. And then as you walk around the museum and you come to where you see the colors, that's a ramp. They wanted a swimming pool, but we treated it like a sacred tank, so you can't tell it's a pool. It looks like a tank with antique sculptures around it. And up that ramp, you come onto a garden where the home of the owners is, which then talks to the scale of the villas that are on the other side. And you go up these ramps, which again pick up colors from the miniature paintings. So these are colors that you see even in the artwork there. So they were very carefully matched. There's a banyan tree. And you come up to a pavilion, which is the home of the owners, which sits on top of the museum on the garden. I'll end with this project. And it's a project, and this is the last one I'll show you. It's actually a low-income housing project. These are the clients, the elephant and the mahout. The mahout is the one who looks after the elephants. It's a very complicated job. Elephants can go rogue. These are elephants that are a remnant of the Mughals. They were used for ceremony and things, and now they're in very bad shape in terms of their health. The mahout, they are largely Muslims in terms of their faith and religion. It's a very Hindu right-wing state, so they are quite marginalized as a community. And at the time we did the project 20 years ago, these guys would earn 5,000 to 6,000 rupees. Well, they would earn less than $100 a month. So really, this is low income. And the government, through a series of interesting accidents, the government floated a competition. We won the competition, and they asked us to design housing, low-income housing for 100 elephants and their keepers and their families. And they gave us a site which had been quarried for its sand, so it was desolate. It was and Jaipur has very little rain. So that's what they did. That was the site we got. They take tourists up They go rogue sometimes. It's very hot. It goes up to 50 degrees centigrade here, so it's in the hundreds, 120. And they go up these ramparts in Jaipur. They get painted with these colors, which are very toxic, so it discolors their skin. And they were used, I mean, that's from the New York Times. When tourists went, they were made to feel like Maharajas for a day. So that's what the elephants are. This was the housing the government had given the elephants. The elephants were like cars below, and the mahouts lived on top. And mahouts invariably moved down, and they started living in front of the elephants because they have to bond with the elephants. They create a kind of relationship with the elephant. And that's very important, spatially, in terms of how you do that. And that's the site. And so we made water the central protagonist. So it's really a landscape project where we said, unless we had water, I mean, the architecture didn't matter. The others in the competition, because I saw some of the entries, they did beautiful Mughal stables. They were inspired by Mughal architecture. But that wasn't the solution, because unless you had water, this thing wasn't going to work. So we just focused on the water and the landscape and a series of mini dams to catch the water, the species we were going to use. So I think that won us the competition, and that's the master plan we came up with. You can see how desolate the site was. We noticed from Google Images little streams of water. Jaipur gets a few inches of rain in the year. It's essentially a desert climate. And so how one would capture the water, this was our ambition. It all didn't happen, but a lot of it did. And so that was the transformation. That's the site we got when my first site visit in 2007. And then what happened was we managed to excavate some things, and the Public Works Department wanted to get the buildings done because there were no kickbacks involved in the landscape, so they wanted to get as much done quickly, and they did it, and the government collapsed and put a hold to the project. For 3-4 years, nothing happened. We were really very depressed about it, but when I went back there, I realized by default, water had accumulated in the pits that we had made, and it started transforming the landscape. So I took the new chief minister, and I was excited, and she was so excited, she said, let's go and do this. And then we began to do it. And so about 10,000 trees were planted. Once the water was there, you see dish antennas, so life is beginning to sort of take over. But, we of course focused on the architecture, and the government wanted row houses like this with the elephant living behind there, but we transformed that into clusters with courtyards and a hierarchy. So a 450 square foot allocation for the house by adding a small courtyard and then 3 people, family sharing a big courtyard, you actually made it a mansion because people use open-to-sky spaces to sleep. And so therefore, that was our way of tweaking the government's requirement to create something more holistic. We created a roof in metal where the food could be stored, so that would create insulation. So of course, we focused on the architecture, although it's difficult to build it because the budgets were so low. And this was the first phase when it got done. And that's the rampart. You see, they walk all the way there to work, which is really brutal in that summer month. And of course, kids had to be accommodated without it being dangerous. So we had these wonderful windows. The kids could play with it. I learned a lot. Elephants can't lie on a flat ground. They have to lie on a berm. So the profile of their room has to be bermed because otherwise they can't get up. And they come in different sizes. So this could have potentially been my version of that small, medium, large, extra large kind of book. But anyway, it occurred, and that's how it transformed from the basic raw carcass of the houses into what began to happen. And of course, life corrodes architecture, life takes it over. These are when the houses weren't yet formally allocated to them, so they were raw. But you can see some people were, the middle class in Jaipur aspires to have a garden and a lawn because there's no water. They have to buy tankers of water. These guys have more water than they need, so they have the most lush lawns. They grow bougainvillea, they sell flowers. It's wonderful. They've appropriated the courtyard as a kitchen, so they get an extra bedroom. I'm going to read something, and the last 2 slides after that. It's by someone called Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who is a very well-known political commentator, and he did a special issue of a magazine called Caravan on equity in India. And I'm quoting him, he said, in a society driven by deep inequality, and the reason I'm reading this is because my experience working on a project like this with the Public Works Department, who were very chauvinist in their attitude, working with the Muslim community, which is very marginalized in that kind of society, one realized the lack of empathy that existed within the bureaucracy. And I found, as an architect, I was the only one who had the ability to be empathetic to the needs of the mahouts and the elephants by extension, but also have the ability to call up the chief minister and ask for an appointment and go and lobby and advocate for something better and put the public works department in their place by reading their tender documents more carefully and finding the tweaks in it, etc. So it was an interesting role, and when I came across this, I thought it resonated. He said, where society is driven by deep inequality, there's not even a minimal basis for mutual concern. Where social distance makes human beings almost a different species in each other's eyes, why would you expect anything else? Why would a contractor care if one of his construction workers used his hand rather than a brush to apply a dangerous chemical? The more inequality there is, the harder it is to imagine what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. It has to be admitted that even the most well-meaning and sensitive find it hard to imagine what the suffocation, darkness, and sheer physical suffering of being at the bottom of the social hierarchy might really be like. The very thing you would expect to instigate questions of justice makes it hard to even raise them. And this project for me was all about learning that whole sort of aspect of the architect's role and how we have a great responsibility to bring people through spatial manipulations into at least some sense of equal access. And the fact that they suddenly had an environment which, although they were yet poor, was comparable to the middle class just through the way nature existed here and the way they could embrace nature, for me was the success of the project. And this has gone up and goes up through ups and downs. Now the current government has put it aside. They don't want to sponsor it. So it's gone to pot. There'll be another government and we'll revive it. So it goes through its ups and downs, and it'll have its own life because we weren't anxious about the architecture here. We just wanted to create the bones or the framework or the armature for a habitation. And for me, this is a middle-scale project where it's architecture, it's planning, it's landscape, it's urban design. It all kind of comes together. Somebody wrote a book on it. You can find it online. Someone called Sanjeev Vidyatri from UIC, who happens to be from Jaipur. And he's done a very deep analysis, interviewing government people, contractors, to see what comes out of it. And it's been interesting. That family gets along well, so they share their chicken, and that guy's looking for dinner. Others don't get along, and they've separated their kind of quarters and gardens. And then this was another interesting lesson. The mahouts asked us, and this is what I mean by the empowerment the architect has. The mahouts told us that, look, elephants they're very social. They can't be left alone. If they get left alone for too long, they get rogue. So they've got to go and hang out with their buddies. So make us a pavilion where they can hang out with their buddies. And so we had no material. This wasn't in the public works department spec. So all the plumbing pipes that were left, we assembled them, and with thatch, we made this pavilion so the elephants could hang out with their buddies. What was remarkable when I went back 4 or 5 years later was the mahouts' children, who are all very savvy on social media, started a firm called Elephantastic, and they had a post where if a tourist came and fed the elephant, they would charge them 50 rupees. If you wanted to have a bath with the elephant, they charged you 100 rupees. So they made a whole economy out of that. And that was just because that pavilion was put. Not my idea, they asked me. So there are these unintended consequences that occur if you're listening to the people using the space, which in this project by default we did, and that was learning. And so therefore then we started proposing, convinced the government to do many more pavilions with water troughs where they could hang out with their buddies. Some of it got built, some of it didn't get built. But you see the transformation with the landscape, the trees. This was about 7 years or 8 years later. It's like a forest almost, where there was not a sapling on that ground. And then this was our creation. We told the chief minister, who was very sympathetic then, look, let's make a little guest house, 4 rooms around a courtyard, very simple, which can overlook the water bodies, so tourists can be very discreet in the way they engage with this real sort of place. And then, of course, we did many forms of infrastructure. Our aspiration was in a desert to bring this kind of wetness, that humidity, which is what elephants needed because they're tropical beings, so to speak. And this is what it looks like. This was an image one of the mahouts kids sent me 2 monsoons ago, where it's all overgrown. In the summer, the water drops completely because it gets very hot. This is, you see the skin of the elephant, how tarred it is because of those toxic chemicals. And the mahouts told us that the two things that they got out of the water body, one is the elephants are healthier, but the other is the bonding between the mahout and the elephant is fantastic, because their most comforting moment is when they're in the water and when they spray themselves. And then in the summer, when it's very low, the mahouts actually sit and rub water on them, scratch their backs with stone. You see the guest house sitting up there. The water rises that 8 feet in the monsoon. This would have been when the water is very, very low. And you can see there, this was taken a little later. They're looking healthier, and that access to water really made the difference. What was surprising is as they got allocated homes, they started painting birds on their homes. We thought they'd paint elephants and things because that's the tradition. And then we realized because of the 10,000 trees, or more, because of the water bodies, this has become a great attractor for birds. And there were people coming here to bird watch now. And so these guys began to pick up on that motive as they decorated their homes. And the lowest parts of the site have actually become like forests because the water just drains there really naturally. This was a mapping we did of the 10 years of the project and which government was in power, what letters I wrote as a part of an exhibition. And it was wonderful, the patterns that emerged from this in terms of advocating. And I realized that I think we had the ability maybe by default to keep them all on the same side of the table in some way. And what I really learned from it is that, what happens in our projects is we have a client. We take the client as the client. Actually, you can differentiate the client. Every client, embedded in every client, there's a patron client, there's an operational client, and there's a user client. In a university campus, the patron client might be the president of the university, or in a foundation. The operational client is the campus architect, engineer who's executing. The users are the students and the faculty. We land up aligning with one aspect of the client. Either we come and ride roughshod if the president has appointed us and we feel we can push anything through, or we are radical and want to get the students to participate. But I think we should be able to do all three. And so in a single family house, the client collapses into one person or a couple at the most. And in government and public projects, it gets even much more differentiated. And how we navigate that, I think, for me, from this project, was a very interesting lesson. And so it really has made me think that both the practice of research and the practice of building, of architecture, it's really, we talk about the practice of architecture. I think we need to spend more time on the architecture of practice. As I was talking about research and advocacy, and how are these formulated into a form of practice? What is the architecture of practice? I don't think we spend enough time on this. This is not a swipe at the AIA or anything like that, yeah? But I think the AIA could also have something on the architecture of practice, which are different models of practice. We shouldn't, the simultaneous validity of different ways of doing the same thing. We either become academics, practitioners, we do a little bit of both, we don't go into advocacy adequately. I think we can do it all simultaneously. And so I think that for me is very important. And so can architecture in a time of flux, a flux or the architecture of transitions be cultivated? Can this be taught? That is a question to all of us as academics. Is it about learning and research involved in architecture, or the surpluses of knowledge that architectural projects generate rather than begin with? Which for me was what I was trying to share with you in the last project. Those were the surpluses that I was the benefactor of at the end of the project. I didn't start with that, but we don't pay that enough attention. I think that is something that pedagogy could address. This truly is about the multiplicity in terms of concerns, modes of engagement, and more importantly, modes by which ideas are let out in the world to gain agency, to become the places in which its life inhabits the planet, creating an architecture that looks outward to embrace the context in the broadest sense and negotiates context in all its diverse complexity. And I think that rubric of the context is a way to imagine this. This process is definitely not linear, but one that is imagined as a matrix to operate within. Thus, if we are to respond to the provocation of the notion of multiplicity or forms of practice and the investigation of forces that generate uncertainty and change in contemporary architecture, we must articulate a position that that rejects the celebration of the practice of architecture, but rather we should aspire to finding new forms of the architecture of practice which are relevant to grapple within the challenges of the future. And I think an architecture of practice that makes the shift to transitionary thinking, which makes central the idea of interconnectedness of social, economic, political, and natural systems by accepting that they are in flux. It brings a shift, I believe, in the culture of practice to respond to the uncertainty that surrounds us by embracing a multiplicity of modes and operating in a framework or armature in which research extends into pedagogy and making buildings embrace advocacy as being integral to the process of that production. And I think this is a way, I believe, one might be able to imagine a new form of practice that could be effective with dealing with all the kind of flux that we currently are subjected to. Thank you very much. Questions? Sure.
We'll now open to questions, and I will bring you the mic.
Yes. I'll change the slide.
Yes.
Hi. It's really nice to hear from your about your projects and like the deep humanity kind of that like embedded within the projects. And you mentioned a little bit with the elephant project that there's a conflict between the client, the patron, the government being kind of chauvinistic, and then the your deep kind of interest to create structures for the user. So I was wondering, how did you ultimately mitigate this kind of conflict of interest? Did you find yourself having to speak a different language to the patrons, so to speak, and to kind of actually make something for the users? Or was there ultimately something, like did people actually end up getting on the same page for the project?
Well, all of the above. And, it's not a project that has landed very neatly. And like I said, God knows what. Life corrodes architecture at the level of housing always. And in this case, it'll be accelerated. But I think just the ability to get them on. So let me just tell you specifically. So with the Mahouts, I had the ability in terms of my access to the language to sit with them and have lunch, and they would cook me biryani, and it would be an atmosphere where they would tell me what they needed, like those pavilions and things like that, correct? I would then solicit a appointment with the chief minister under who this comes, and she's powerful. It was a woman, now it's a guy. And, try to create some empathy within that. And then, of course, the public works department would scuttle it on a technical ground. This is not in the tender, this is a deviation. Then one would find ways of creating those trade-offs in terms of offsetting it with some other item and things like that. But we found we were equipped to do all those three things. Now, if I didn't have empathy for the Mahouts, who actually I loved, and the elephants and things, I would have just done what the public works department asked me to do, right? And the project would have been somewhere else. Or if I didn't have the wherewithal to have access to the chief minister, which I had to do through friends in Delhi, and because they're politicians, the public works department would have just, they would have become the clients. And so I think, like even in Sept University with the library and things, it was actually, I started beginning to understand this dynamic at that time, because Ahmedabad, the Sept University, there's a foundation, there's a chairman of the foundation who's part of the Lalbhai family, which is one of the old families. They were the ones, this is the grandson of the person who was a patron to Korb and Khan, so he's very proud about creating good architecture. So I had his sympathy, and then the students and faculty, because I studied there, I knew which cupboard everyone's skeletons were in, so I could pick them, and sort of, at least I knew what the aspirations would be. I was a student, I didn't want to do something that would be proper. And then there was a building committee, which were faculty, some of who were, who had graduated ahead of me in school, So it was a matter of getting them all on the same page. Now, the students sometimes didn't have the confidence to tell the faculty what they wanted. The faculty didn't have the confidence to go to the chairman of the trust to tell them what they wanted. I felt I began to play that role. And so we have to, I don't know whether cultivate is not the right word, but we have to become more conscious that as an intrinsic part of our role, that is getting everyone on the same side of the table, right? Otherwise, for our own comfort or our lack of imagination of this complex terrain, we align with one component of the client. And that always doesn't. And sometimes the client is someone who has that vision, but then there are other people. I mean, you have to get good concrete work, so then you're talking, so there are many players that and we have to just become more conscious. And I think pedagogy has to also cultivate that understanding. And that's why I feel this sort of formulation of the context is something we have to get more expansive about. I mean, I believe every school of architecture should have a required course in the first semester on the contemporary state of that locality. So if it was in Ahmedabad, they should do a semester-long required class on contemporary India in terms of its politics, the Dalit question, all of that. And similarly, I mean, the US will be impossible to do right now, of course, but we can try.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the lecture. Just to continue the previous, or the conversation in a way, this brings us to a place where things are quite local in a sense,
Yep.
like the language, knowing the culture, knowing how people work. So I just wanted you to go a little bit deeper in that, because at some point you were talking of that monsoon cloud arriving,
yeah.
and talking of a certain latitude, but isn't it much more local than that?
Oh, yes. I mean, so I think the point I was trying to make there is, if you emblematic, when I say context, it's about nestling scales, right? We do that in architecture. If you're looking at a building, you look at the street, you might look at the city, etc. So I think the local is also, I mean, and that's why I think global, it means you almost go to the planetary scale. So you take the locality, but have the ability to nestle it in other things. And at those intersections is where we get our real nourishment for architecture, I believe. And so I think that chart was here. We're also part of the tropics. Now it's tangible for me to understand that as a zone of where I could be influential, because what I might do in Mumbai, because it's also in the tropic, might be useful for the tropics. But I'd yet have many other things that would be very local to Jaipur or to Mumbai and my practice for whatever I have to keep correcting my colleagues at the GSD, who just because I go between Mumbai and Boston they tease me as being a global practitioner. I'm the only one whose work is in India, right? I have no work in the US, or I have no work. All my work is in India. So for me, the university is a way to go back and reflect on that, and students gain from that, I hope. But I think being local is more critical. Architecture is not a movable feast. We have made it a movable feast. Or you have architects who work globally, but then they have to have a sensitivity to be able to connect to moments, a view, a window, something. Otherwise, you're transmitting drawings by email, and that's what. What I didn't show you was my book on, I think Eric alluded to. I did a book in 1990 called Architecture in India since 1990. And I took 1990 because I started my practice exactly that year, and I wanted to talk about it in the first person, but also because that's when we liberalized our economy. So it was called Architecture in India since 1990. And it was called Architecture in India because everything that's written before that on architecture in India, it was a festival Charles Correa did, Raj Rival did, Doshi talked about it. It was always an architecture for India because it was about Nehru's vision. So that generation of architects, rightly so, this is not a criticism, rightly so, were imagining a pan-Indian identity because that was the mission for that generation. Because we had got independence, it was the first time the idea of India had been formulated. So it was an architecture for India. But when I framed it by saying architecture in India, it automatically localized it. And what I did in the book was look at models of practice, and I broke it down into 4 large categories. One was called global practices, the other was called regional, third was called alternate, and fourth was called counter-modernism. Because in India, a lot of temples are being built. They're the biggest forms of institutional structures, partly because of the right-wing politics that are prevalent right now. They're bigger than any convention center or art gallery or anything being built. And they're all built in ancient images, right? With practices which are not about drawings, it's about scripture and all of that. And then working back, you had alternate practices, which is people like Laurie Baker, I don't know if you're familiar with, but who worked directly with craftspeople. They were working on low-income housing, but had really scaled it up. The third, the regional, was all the folks we know. Anyone you would have heard about in India would fall in that category, which they have the wherewithal of how global practices could be operated, but they have an empathy for the locality. I would say Doshi, Charles Correa, my work, all of it. And then you have global practices, which is HOK and SOM emailing drawings for a building in downtown Mumbai without visiting the site and stuff like that. So I believe it has to reside in that zone of the regional, and architecture is not a movable feast. It is very, very local. And I think to work across the globe, it needs people of great talent, of very particular skills, which someone here might be attracted to, and also someone who could arrive and be empathetic and understand it. Everyone doesn't do it. And the bigger the corporations get, the less their ability to do it. So the best ones doing work globally are the small practices who can actually engage at a finer level. I don't know if that answers.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you again, and to continue the conversation, I appreciate the optimism in your work and the way you talk about it, and I think it's inspirational for the students in the room, for the professionals as well. I'm curious a little bit about some of the projects that seem to, you're in the show me state of Missouri, where there's this idea that if it's not been done before, you have to, prove it to me that it will work. And I think these ideas of looking at a desert and then imagining it being a lush, tropical type landscape is incredibly transformative. Same with the office building. A certain level of your ability to convince or have confidence in your own ideas or the ideas of the office. It would seem that some of the ideas are far grander in their ultimate experience than maybe you would have envisioned. But those are some pretty large shifts in seeing a desert become a green space. Are there times when you see things that go beyond your imagination? And also, how do you, I think if you've pulled that off a few times in your career, maybe you can point to that and say, hey, trust me. I couldn't do this again, but I think it takes a certain level of willingness on your part beyond potential research to just believe in an idea, and maybe you could speak a little more deeply on that.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to give you it'll be for someone else to judge in a sense, and I recently, my two recent books, one is called Working in Mumbai, and I call it Working, not practicing, and not our firm's name, because I think it's labor, so it's about work. And that is a first-person reflection on 30 years of practice. And so many of the questions you're asking, actually, one speaks about there in reflection, right? And the other book it's on 30 years of writing. And I think there's a connection, because I think in retrospect, one made an effort to write and reflect as much as one could, which sharpens ways that you might not only feel confident about an idea, but also how you might advocate it. And that's the reason why in that multiplicity model, I put advocacy as a major chunk, because, I never taught for a day when I was in India till 2003. My first job was at the University of Michigan, but I'd been doing a lot of advocacy work. So when I came to teach, for me, it was so natural. I kicked myself to say, why didn't I teach? Because advocacy was a form of maybe teaching a broader constituency. And so I think I really feel more and more in reflection that in the way we structure the architecture of our practice, I think we must make these all the normal, make them normative. We've either practiced and we don't, and I'm not saying everyone's got to write, But I think if you had a multiplicity of engagements, of forms as an architect, whether it was advocating using instruments that the school here makes. Patty draws up fantastic ideas to rebuild St. Louis, and you begin to act as an advocate in some formulation to do that. I think to add those dimensions to that architecture of practice, I think is critical for all of us going forward. The architect can't be the isolated practitioners. We have to sit in the context of the context. And I think, for me, that's the biggest learning. Now, specifically to your question, yes, sometimes there were disappointments, sometimes people didn't understand, sometimes it was a very slow, patient process. We make a lot of models, and so a lot of time was that the Elephant Project, it went on for 10 years. Our fees were exhausted in 9 months. So it was a cross-subsidy project. We just said, this is a mission, we've got to do this, and we're doing 2 other corporate buildings or an institution. Let's put a little percentage towards this to cover it. We just created an internal cross-subsidy. So those are some hard decisions, and I think the more we, like a 4-legged stool is more stable than a 1-legged stool. So the more we spread out our engagements, I think we'll be better citizens, I believe. I don't know if that... And you're starting the architecture week, so best of luck for that. Thanks.